Hi YouTube, it's a summary guy here, and this is my first YouTube video. I've had a couple of ideas recently that I've wanted to expand upon and get some feedback for, and with that I'm attempting to put my name in the YouTube ring. I'm an avid retro video game player and collector, and thus my first topic will be about retro gaming, collecting, and my general thoughts and concerns with the state of the hobby. Hopefully I get some feedback on this topic and from people and gain a little bit of a following. Also, I hope to get some feedback on the quality of my video. I hopefully will improve over time if I continue to do this, but here goes. Just a brief overview of myself. I've been collecting retro video games more or less since I've been playing them. I just didn't really know it at the time. But my family never really traded in games to GameStops or Funko Lands or Babbage's, mainly because the return of investment was terrible. When my NES broke back in the mid-90s, we did put it in the trash, which I guess sucks because it probably just needed a new pin connector. But at least my mom saw it, and the trash man specifically pick out that box aside as if he was going to keep it, so I'm glad somebody tested their luck with it other than me. We had a handful of rare, I don't know if rare is the right word, but at least valuable games in that collection, such as later Mega Man's, Dragon Warriors. We had Fire and Ice, but those unfortunately went with the console. I will say I managed to keep my favorite NES game, Bucky O'Hare, which in the past few years has kind of gained a little bit of steam and popularity and left the world as a hidden gem. But I had the toys as a kid, loved the cartoon. I even went as Bucky for Halloween one year, so I hid the game from my parents, and it quickly became the oldest piece of my collection in terms of length of ownership. When my brother and I were considering getting an N64 in 96, 97, we were going to trade in our Super Nintendo games and console to a store. My dad, having purchased many of these games for Christmas and birthday presents, saw how much money he was getting via trade-in, and in front of the workers at the store, basically just looked annoyed at the trade-in values being so low and paid the difference the trade-in was going to give us, me and my brother, in store credit. That car ride home, my brother and I were looking at the back of the box of the Nintendo 64 in so much excitement, just staring at these one-picture screens of Mario 64 or Mario Kart. And I remember my dad giving us this pseudo-lecture of economics and supply and demand and, return of investment, and telling us basically just hoping that, once the value of a game becomes so low, you might as well just keep it and hope that it gain some of its value back. It's funny because I guess something that he said there stuck with me. My dad was a fairly big book collector throughout his life, so maybe I just get some of my collecting desires from him, but he at least taught me some value, I would say, that you can apply to more than just video games. Anyway, since 2007 or so, but I would specifically say in the past 5 years, retro game collecting and retro game playing has become very expensive to most people's awareness. It has pretty much killed my excitement for the hunt, unfortunately, which is depressing. I was fortunate that I didn't have to rebuy much of my old collection other than some NES games I wanted back in my library. But I've gone from flea market hunting and garage sale searching every weekend in high school and early college to not really caring at all anymore, despite having more money to do so. So these are my 5 reasons why I think game collecting for all systems are pretty much done, and the reason why it rapidly approached this state. Perhaps it's more of a reflection on the cause of the rise of prices, I'm not sure. But without further ado, here we go. So the first reason I wanted to mention it, and this is in no particular order, by the way, was mobile devices. There are 2 components to mobile devices and the effect that I think that they've had on the retro collecting scene. First off, they are portable lookup devices which allow anyone to be semi-knowledgeable about any obscure item, which will drive up prices when something is found in the hunt. This isn't even relegated to retro game collecting, but game collecting, it's probably more noticeable than most other hobbies because there are so many consoles, games, accessories, etc. to potentially collect for. For example, I didn't own a Sega console till I bought a used Saturn from a friend in 2002, as I was a Nintendo Till I Die fanboy in the 90s. I didn't know anything about the Saturn besides the basics until I owned the system, and I had a lot of catching up to do in the homework department to know prices of games that I would find in the wild. This homework took time due to the lack of a centralized knowledge base at the time, but it also took a memory. This is because smartphones weren't a mainstream thing yet, and you could just pick up your phone now and check eBay if you were to find a Shining Force 3 at the flea market. Shining Force 3 was one of the first pickups I had for the system, which is the reason why the anecdote for the video. I love the voice acting in that game. People think that eBay prices at swap meets, though, only just recently became the norm. That's not entirely true. Big money hadn't hit retro games yet, so these prices didn't look at eBay as the norm, just as a guide. Most games at flea markets in my area were priced a reasonable amount below eBay, but it was still obvious that eBay was being used as the starting point by most of these sellers. The second component to mobile devices is more specifically the on-the-go aspect of shopping. This is mainly for auction sites such as the aforementioned eBay or a Shop Goodwill nowadays, but it could even apply to Amazon, I suppose, as well. The ability to check your active bids whenever and wherever you like without having to be at a more stationary location like a desktop or a laptop has made bidding on these things easy as hell, which has only increased prices. If you wanted to get an item cheaper back in the pre-smartphone era, you could specifically see games with auctions ending on Friday or Saturday nights or holidays or even during events like the Super Bowl go for slightly less money. It wasn't a lot less, but it was definitely a bit and a noticeable amount cheaper. This is not the case anymore. The phone app allows somebody to basically just whip out their phone while doing something completely different, snipe the bid real fast, and go back to whatever they were doing. I'll admit, as I've gotten older and I've had things to do on Friday nights or during the Super Bowl, I've taken advantage of this, but to not mention this as a potential reason why prices have increased would be wrong. The next part I wanted to mention was YouTubers. Now, I don't want to talk about this part too much because I'm afraid it might annoy somebody, assuming anybody watches this video or listens to it, I suppose. I understand this is poorly produced, but hopefully it's interesting. I will say that most of the retro community that has created a lot of content has been good content, fun watches, informative, etc. I will say the humor hasn't been quite my thing, but that's more of a taste thing than anything else, I suppose. I'm not going to name specific names because I don't want anybody to be singled out, but there is an obvious trend with when a big YouTuber has a retro review or a let's play to see it go up in price. I haven't been too up to date with who's talking about what these days, but the most recent time I remember seeing a major price hike with a game was a game I mentioned earlier in my little intro, Bucky O'Hare. Around late 2013, this game went from about $40 to about $80 loose in a few months. Now the price since then has only increased about $20 or $30 more from what I've seen in about 2+ years. But I remember a handful of YouTubers, including some popular ones, review this game and talk about it as a potential hidden gem. I wouldn't call the game that obscure anymore, and definitely not in the retro crowd, but it is a good example of YouTubers creating a bit of the increase in price. Another specific game I would like to single out was that a Let's Play specifically affected the price was Mega Man 7, starting around 2012. The game was a $50 loose game for years, to my memory, and now it's started to make its way to $200 loose, if not more. A complete in-box Mega Man 7, which honestly I would say is an average at best game, is becoming the levels of, a complete in-box Earthbound in price, which, Earthbound probably being the gateway to the collecting the big games. So YouTube, while I don't want to single out too much because I do enjoy the content, I do think has been a major factor in the increase in prices of these retro games. So the third reason is perhaps everybody's least favorite thing about the hobby, which is resellers. You knew this was going to be mentioned, right? Resellers are easily the most hated part and most often the most blamed part for the rise of prices. You have the flea market seller regulars who run around the flea market before the shoppers get there, trying to find a non-regular seller who might have things very cheap. Then they immediately mark up the prices and kind of, hurt the hobby for everybody else, if you will. You also have the people with the sell me your games ads on Craigslist, sometimes as a local business, or sometimes it's probably a collector as well. But frequently I notice that they seem to be people that try to flip these games and try to, rob people blind of what they might have. The ones I pity the most are probably the Goodwill scanners who walk into a Goodwill with one of these devices or even a cell phone app that acts as a barcode scanner, which looks up an item on Amazon or eBay, which they then try to sell there for more money. Those are some of the saddest people I've ever laid eyes on. No offense to anybody who does do that for part-time money, if you will. But I do think there is a universal bond that the game collecting community has that's very anti-reseller, that is honestly being somewhat used as a shift of blame from us to them. And I don't think that resellers are the primary problem with the increase of prices or a lot of people's maybe decline in interest in retro game collecting. With that said, it needed to be mentioned because it is a factor of the increase in prices and is something that needs to be mentioned for my 5 reasons, because I do think this is one of the biggest reasons. I just think that it is perhaps overly stated by the retro game community, the evils, if you will, of the reselling community. My 4th reason, or number 2 if we're doing this in a backward list, which I had no intentions of doing, is perhaps the most depressing or Twilight Zone-y, if you will, in reason, and that is the supply was going to run out eventually. We are getting to a breaking point where the resources are running dry, the gold rush is ending, if you will, the well is drying up. With the supply running out, the prices were only going to go up eventually no matter what. If it took 5 years or 25 years, prices would slowly rise due to the fact that these games aren't being manufactured anymore. I think gamers themselves have to blame a little bit for this one, though. I think there has been a lot of increased anxiety in some collectors due to collectors showing off their stuff, worried about losing that eBay auction, and the price of that particular game then only has increased since, and a general feeling like others are getting great deals while you aren't, so you're always on this on the hunt mode. Not to get too topical here, but I also think there are some serious OCD, obsessive compulsive tendencies that a lot of collectors, myself included, have, which have shrunk this supply much quicker than expected. But the supply has gone down a lot, so much that some games will have now more reproductions on sale at eBay than the original released game. And I'm not just talking about games with some sort of rare backstory, such as a stadium events or Nintendo World Championships. Little Samson is a rare game now for sure, but as recent as 2010 it was only $100. Now on eBay, if you search Little Samson, you're going to have to sift through a bunch of reproductions, PAL releases, and other crap that nobody really wants to collect for. My prediction here is that within a few years, not just the rare games, but even uncommon games sold will be coming from collectors trimming their fat, if you will, trying to pay bills that they might now have as they've gotten older. For some consoles, that is. Newer systems might have a bit more time, but I think we're already seeing NES and Super Nintendo games have this trend of reproductions being fairly prominent on eBay, and some sellers now just selling their actual, original released game. So the well was going to dry up eventually, and I hate to sound like that because nobody likes to hear that kind of, prediction, but it was bound to happen. Maybe we just expedited the process, starting with some of these other factors that I've previously mentioned. And last but certainly not least, the last reason I wanted to touch upon was that current gen gaming has changed a lot this past decade, which I think has caused a lot of people to want to go back to the prior days. This is a grander issue that I want to dedicate a potential series of videos to, but in the mid-2000s, gaming saw a bunch of changes to it, which I think caused gamers to want to go back to a different time. During this time period, we saw a shift from Japanese-developed console games to Western-developed console games, and I know a lot of people that liked Japanese-developed console games and then had the PC for the Western-developed console games. This generation also saw a blend between the consoles, as the 360 and PS3 had very few exclusives compared to prior generations, despite this generation being one of the longest ones we've ever had. A lot of technical issues have also plagued gaming since the PS Wii 60 generation took off, such as downloadable content issues, always online DRM problems, updating games as soon as you take them home from the store, stuff like that. On a small side note, I'd also think that we need to mention that, this generation came during, the largest economic recession post World War II, which might have also caused some desire for nostalgia. In summary, the 5 reasons that I really wanted to touch upon for why I think game collecting for all systems is pretty much over. You have mobile devices serving as a centralized location of information for people who, no matter where they are in the world. You have YouTubers, which increased the demand for these games. You have resellers that took advantage of the increased demand. You have the fact that the well was going to dry up eventually. And then you have the major nostalgia because there's a lot of uncertainty amongst current gen, and by current gen I mean mid-2000s onward, PS, Wii 60 generation, and now the PS4, Xbox One, Wii U. All of those changes saw the retro market to become viable and an increase in prices. Most people think that gaming has this one sort of BC to AD moment, 0 AD in the gaming timeline being the crash of 1983. I do think that's a bit outdated now, and gaming has become 3 periods. Before the crash into the 7th generation, and now the 7th generation to the present. Anyway, this segment has been my first attempt to voice some of my thoughts, and is getting a bit long now, and it's probably poorly produced. But I would like to hear what others have to say about it. Do you think it's still worth collecting retro games? Has the prices gone out of control for you? If yes, when was it do you think that the prices have gotten out of hand? Have you embraced other methods to play retro games? Would something like buying a Raspberry Pi for like a personal retro machine be a potential idea for you? Let me know what you think. Feel free to give me your feedback, and most of all, thanks for listening to my opinion and my sharing of my thoughts. I hope to see you next time.